Hi, everyone. Welcome to Big Bang Week by the Wigtown Book Festival. My name is Jessica Fox. I am an author, a filmmaker, and also a former NASA storyteller. And tonight we have a very special guest. We have Christina Mackaill here, Dr. Christina Mackaill. Before I introduce her, I just want to remind everyone that these amazing events are coming to you for free, thanks to the very generous donations from our sponsors, bottom of the screen, and also you. And if you would like to donate, there are many opportunities to do so. You can go to the Wigtown Book Festival Company's website, or you can buy a book through the festival shop, and it'll go directly back into the charity. So tonight's guest, Dr. Mackaill, is not only a clinical fellow at Crossroads University Hospital in Kilmarnock, but in 2016, which is very cool, she founded Scotland's first ever space medicine society. And currently, she is part of a medical team that's conducting a simulated astronaut mission in Israel in the Negev desert. So welcome, Dr. Mackaill. So nice to have you here.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I cannot tell you, I've been looking forward to this all week. So can you tell everyone a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. So my name's Christina. As you said, I'm a doctor. I'm a clinical fellow currently in Crosshouse in emergency medicine. Going back to the start, I grew up in a small town in East Lothian, which is outside Edinburgh. Then I went on to do biomedical science, which was great, up in Aberdeen. And then I went on to do another degree in medicine in Glasgow.
Wow.
Basically moved all over Scotland because I went from Edinburgh to Aberdeen to Glasgow. Then I did my first 2 years of training up in Dundee, and now I've been going to Glasgow for the past year and a half. So I'm basically just doing a tour of Scotland, which is great. So yeah, I'm doing emergency medicine at the moment, and I want to pursue that as a career. But I got into space medicine when I was at university, and it's basically just been a passion of mine ever since.
Wow.
At university, we get to a chance, like an opportunity to choose a specialty we're really interested in. So, for my first one, I did an emergency kind of elective in Chicago on trauma, which was insane.
That's intense.
Yeah, it was intense. I mean, it was just a whole different world from Scotland. But for my second one, I can't even remember how I heard that space medicine was a thing, but I did. And once I did, I was like, that sounds like the coolest thing ever. Yeah. So I did a bit of research, and I kind of emailed here and there. And then a lovely anaesthetist in Glasgow put me in touch with Professor Thais Russamano, who's a big kind of researcher and a big name in the space medicine world. And I met up with her, and she invited me out to Brazil, and we did this study related to CPR in space. And ever since then, things have just kind of spiraled, and I've been really obsessed with it and done a lot of work in the field. So that's kind of my background, yeah.
This is that's amazing. So there's so much that you just fit into those couple sentences about your background. No, it's incredible. So I'm going to unpick them a bit. And I just wanted to invite people who are watching tonight, you can ask questions, and we will save them for the end. I will be reading your questions so that you can ask Christina your own. But not to simplify things, in my imagination, you've gone from ER, the show ER, to basically Star Trek, where you're going to be the space doctor on board the Starship Enterprise. So can we talk a little bit about going from emergency medicine and what sparked your imagination? What really drew you to space?
So I think the exciting thing about space medicine is space medicine's been around for a really long time, as in it's been around since we started sending people to space in the 60s, but it's a relatively new specialty in the UK. So it was only kind of recognised as a specialty in 2016. So here it's very fresh, it's very new, it's very exciting. And I think the thing is, we've had the ISS around for quite some time. But now we're talking about going back to the moon, we're talking about going to Mars, and it's just a whole different ballgame medically. Mainly because even on the ISS, although it is far away and is in space, there is potential to come back to Earth in a true emergency, and it would take a few hours. The moon can take about 3 days to get to. Mars can take sort of 6 to 8 months, depending on how the planets are aligned. So you have to prepare for scenarios where you can't just turn around and come back to Earth. And it's all very new and exciting, and there's a lot of questions that haven't been answered yet. So I guess because I love emergency medicine and I'm really excited about that on Earth, it's even more exciting to think about emergency medicine that hasn't even been kind of thought of yet in a completely different environment. And it's kind of the future. I mean, a lot of the research we're doing is all new and fresh, and it's really exciting because you really feel like you're making a difference because you're the first person that's said this or done this in that field, if you know what I mean. So, yeah.
So you just said something that's pretty unusual where you say you love emergency medicine. Emergencies terrify me. And I saw also that you're someone who does like Tough Mudder. And so clearly, I did see that. So you love to be challenged. What about emergency medicine? Before we go to the space bit, what about that do you love?
I feel like, I've got an interview for training in a few weeks, and that's probably what they're going to ask me.
This is good practice.
I wasn't expecting to ask. That's a very good on-the-spot question. I think the thing about emergency medicine is, and it sounds cliche, but every single shift is different. Like, you have absolutely no idea what's going to come in the door. And that's what's really exciting about it. Like, you could have something kind of straightforward, like a broken arm, and then you could have a phone call saying in 5 minutes a massive trauma is going to arrive, a massive car accident, there's loads of people, and you have to just be prepared. You have to be in the mindset. I like the challenge of it. I like the pressure. I like how fast paced it can be. You have to think, you have to problem solve really quickly and think fast on your feet. And sometimes with emergency medicine as well, you see that the difference you make really quickly. So, you give a painkiller and you see that person so much better. You give them fluids and they're a lot brighter. You give them an antibiotic and they're less sick. So you can kind of see the changes you make, and it's really kind of rewarding in that way. But I think I just love that it's just so different and broad, and you have to kind of know a bit about everything as well, which is really exciting. So I just love it. Yeah.
Okay, first of all, you would be like my teammate for anything, not just in space. You're a person clearly good to have around. So can we talk about, for the layman like me, whether it's the International Space Station or maybe longer missions to Mars, what are the challenges? What do you have to imagine might come up, and whether they're emergencies in space or even the long-term effects on the body of being in space?
Yeah, so I'll talk a bit about the changes that the body goes through in space, and I forgot to remind Andy that I do have.
That's great.
So I'll prompt him.
Okay.
But I will talk about the changes the body goes through in space. It's a pretty big topic. Okay. But other than the changes that we face in microgravity, and microgravity is basically because the ISS is orbiting Earth and it's in a kind of free fall motion, you've got this near weightlessness, and that is the thing that changes the physiology of the body in space. So I'll talk about that after. But other considerations about medicine in space are things like you've not got all the medical supplies that you would have in a hospital on Earth, for a start, and that's a kind of cost, weight, storage thing.
Yep.
The other thing is drugs in space, so just simple medicines like antibiotics, painkillers. Trying to think of other medicines, but basic medicines. You don't know how radiation is going to affect how long they last in space. You don't know, because the physiology of the body is changing. You don't know how that drug is going to work in space as well.
And the circulation, I can imagine, is a bit different.
Yeah.
In weightlessness? Okay.
Yeah, exactly. No, I am going to talk about that, but that poses a problem for simple things like drugs. Yeah. Other kind of practical considerations are when you're on Mars, so a big thing that a space doctor does is telemedicine. So it means they can kind of connect with astronauts from Earth, talk them through emergencies, talk them through medical scenarios and things like that. On the ISS, it's fine, but when they're on Mars, there might be a time delay of 8 to 56 minutes, depending on how the minutes are aligned, which is absolutely mental. If they, come back to Earth and they're like, "Oh my God, something terrible happened," and then you have to wait
8 minutes later.
So that's a big problem, obviously, as well, and it means that astronauts really need to be trained, even if they don't have a medical background. They all need to be trained to the same level, because it might be the medical one that's hurt. So it's really important that we're all going to train to the same level. Another problem is evacuation. So, emergency here on Earth, they would get an ambulance and go to hospital. But in space, on the ISS, there is potential for medical evacuation, and it would take a few hours to come back to Earth. But the problem is you're coming in at such a fast speed that's maybe not compatible with lots of emergency medical scenarios, especially if you've got ongoing kind of medical things happening. You might have quite an abrupt landing as well. They might be too weak to get out of the capsule in the ocean, things like that. So that can be problematic. Things like a spacewalk. I don't know if you've seen the film Gravity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes,
so,
definitely.
That's
treacherous.
Yeah, it could happen.
Yeah.
So, trauma from a spacewalk. I don't know if you heard about the Italian astronaut Luca Parmitano a few years ago.
No.
A suit malfunction, I think, and his helmet, there was like a big bubble of water and it kind of went over his face and he was fine, but you can imagine how that could have been catastrophic. Like he could have drowned in space, which was mental.
Yes.
And another thing is decompression sickness.
Okay.
So if a big bit of space junk hit the space station, and there was a sudden loss in pressure, going from a high pressure to low pressure really quickly can cause nitrogen bubbles that are already dissolved in the blood to form bubbles, and then it can lead to kind of joint pain and consciousness. It can ultimately kill you. And that's the kind of thing they talk about with divers, the bends, like if they come up too quickly and stuff.
Yes.
That's a big thing too. So there's, other than the physiology, which I will talk about, there's just practical things because you're in this small space, you're floating around, you're far away from Earth, you don't have all the equipment. There's just like practical things as well. And that's just on the ISS. So the big thing about going to Mars and the moon is that you're further away, so you don't even have the evacuation potential. No. You basically have to deal with emergencies on the way, and we need to be capable to do them. And there's a thing called the life limb mission paradigm, and it's essentially a good example I have is on the ISS. If you had like a scratch to your eye and it was causing you some bother, you would have kind of eye drops and see how you got on. But if it wasn't getting better, you'd come home because they wouldn't make you sacrifice your eye, But yes. If you were 5 months on the way to Mars and you had the same problem, you couldn't risk the whole mission and the rest of the crew, so you would lose your eye. So that's what I mean about the life limb mission paradigm. So that's why you have to be prepared for even those kind of scenarios, because everything changes, everything shifts. Because you've got to think about the bigger picture as well.
First of all, I'm such a hypochondriac. Clearly, I'm not capable of going to space and handling all these things, but you must have such an incredible imagination and have to forward think through these scenarios that we haven't even come across yet.
Well, I think the big thing to remember is that anything that's considered an emergency on Earth could technically be an emergency in space.
Yeah. Yes.
Because although astronauts are really fit, healthy individuals, and they're medically screened to the nth degree, because probably the biggest thing about space medicine and space doctors is preventative medicine. So you screen them really, really highly to make sure they don't have any pre-existing problems that are going to cause a problem in space. Yeah. But things happen, and I think I'm sure that I'm probably going to talk a bit about my CPR research a bit later.
Yes.
People kind of say, what is the likelihood of a really fit, healthy astronaut having a heart attack? Well, it's not just about kind of getting older and your arteries stiffening and things. Like, there are lots of reversible causes for a cardiac arrest, and in space there's a lot of those things that could happen to a young, fit, healthy astronaut. So I've kind of lost my train of thought there, but
yeah, no. But in terms of the practical concerns of being in space, a lot of things you were saying that are very likely on Earth.
Yeah, sorry.
Probably would be happening there.
I guess the thing is, it is possible, and you would be kicking yourself if you sent people on the way to Mars and something happened. You're like, why did I not think of that? Because you have to just think about absolutely. It's like disaster management. You have to think of everything that could possibly go wrong. Hope that it doesn't, but at least if it does, you have a plan,
Yes. So Christina, those are the short-term emergency medicine considerations, some of them. You mentioned that there are kind of long-term effects on the body that happen when you're in space. Can you give an example?
Yes, and I could talk all night about this because it's such a thing. Just stop me if I'm
okay, great.
But there's so many things, and as I said, it's because of this different gravitational field that you're in the microgravity environment, and it's such a shock to the system going from gravity, complete gravity to kind of no gravity. So one of the first things that astronauts experience is a change to their vestibular system. And by that, I just mean the kind of balance in the ears and the brain, it's all kind of connected. And they have this weird kind of sense of motion sickness. So their eyes are kind of telling them one thing, like everything's moving, but their body doesn't have a corresponding sense of movement. So it makes them, it's kind of confusing for the brain, and it makes them feel quite sick and nauseous, and it can really affect how they function in the first few days. So that affects 60 to 80% of astronauts in the first 3 days. So it's quite a big thing. Usually gets better, but to kind of avoid it affecting things, they just kind of, in the first few days, they don't do critical tasks, and they kind of avoid sudden head movements. And they also can have like anti-sickness injections and stuff like that. The only time that would really be an emergency is if they were doing a spacewalk with a helmet on, or upon launch or landing, if they were vomiting and it could actually kind of choke them type scenario. That's one of the big things that happens immediately. One of the most noticeable visual things that happens immediately is, I think Andy's got a picture. I sent Andy a picture to show Peggy Whitson, just the comparison of her before space and during space to put up. It's a thing called, sorry, that's, yeah. Next. Sorry, I should have mentioned all these before.
These are awesome.
That's it. So we can always go back and forth. So that's Peggy Whitson before she went into space, and then that's Peggy Whitson when she was in space. So basically what happens is, because there's not gravity, there's a kind of fluid redistribution that happens. So all the fluid kind of shifts upwards, and astronauts get what we call puffy face and chicken legs. And it can cause other problems, which I'll cover a bit later, but that's a kind of noticeable visual thing that happens in the first few days. Because if the fluid shifts, the fluid's kind of shifting in and out of different spaces in the body, and it means that there's actually a lower volume of fluid circulating the body overall. That can cause problems when astronauts come back to Earth and they try and stand up, and their blood pressure basically just drops. So that's quite interesting. It's also interesting in terms of if an astronaut were to, say, be involved in a trauma and start bleeding. So we have stages of shock that the body goes through, and they would essentially skip stage 1 and 2 and go straight to 3 and need kind of blood products and stuff sooner. So that's a total emergency medicine thing, but it's important to think about in terms of emergencies in space and things like that. Another big thing that happens, which is quite well known and well talked about, is that the bones and the muscles in space kind of get weaker. You've maybe heard of that. And it's basically just because they're not getting used like they would on Earth. So on Earth, we're kind of using our bones and muscles all the time because we're walking. But in space, astronauts lose about 1 to 1.6% of their bone mass every month from their pelvis, their hip bones, where else? Wow. Basically the bones that are involved in kind of loading, because they're not using them. So on Earth, bones kind of break down and build at a kind of continuous rate, but in space, I'm not sure they'd really know the mechanism behind it truly yet, but the rate that the bone breaks down kind of supersedes the rate that it's remodeled. So you basically break down, your bones become more dense and weaker. Yeah. And you also excrete more calcium into your bloodstream.
That doesn't sound good.
No, that means that bones get weaker, and that can kind of predispose your risk to fractures in space. So, like, if you were doing a spacewalk and you were hit by something, and also, again, lost my train of thought. Also, just makes you weaker in general, and essentially your muscles have the same problem because they're not being used as much, especially your leg muscles and your arm muscles and stuff. They're becoming a lot weaker because they're not being used. And I think they can lose sort of 20% of their muscle mass in the first few months or something, which is crazy. Wow. So basically the big kind of countermeasure, I remember what I was going to say, sorry, about the calcium being excreted into the blood. So it can predispose astronauts to kidney stones as well.
Yes.
Calcium, sorry. So the big kind of thing for bones and muscles to kind of counteract that process is exercise. So astronauts have to exercise for about 2.5 hours a day, which sounds, I would be so not up for that.
No, do you know, I remember being at the Johnson Space Center and seeing a strange contraption of someone running almost parallel to the ground sideways. And I think they were trying to figure out how to create impact exercise in space. Have they resolved that? Are there things that astronauts can do in zero gravity to get that kind of sense of impact?
Yeah, so I was going to say, so each astronaut has like a tailor-made exercise program, and I'm sure that's based on like their BMI and their muscle to fat ratio and everything. But it basically involves a lot of aerobic exercise and resistive exercise.
Okay.
Their diet's also very important. So they'll have like a calcium-rich diet, and they'll sometimes take bisphosphonates, which are like a drug that encourage kind of bone remodeling and will slow down the process of the bones breaking down. Because the problem is if their muscles, you know, if they didn't kind of counteract this problem when they land on Earth, they wouldn't even be able to stand up because their muscles would be so weak, you know. It would take them a long time to kind of rehabilitate that. But yep, exercise 2.5 hours a day. And I'm pretty sure Tim Peake ran a marathon in space.
Oh, wow.
Pretty cool.
That's pretty amazing. So
yeah, you can imagine if you just wanted to have a lazy day, but you were told that you had to run on a treadmill for 2 hours. How upset you about that, but it's really important.
Christina, I thought I saw a picture amongst your lovely pictures of someone exercising.
Yes, I did. Sorry. Yes, I keep forgetting about the pictures.
That's the one.
So as you can see, he's like strapped because you're probably wondering how you run in space. They kind of get strapped into a kind of harness thing, and then they can run, which is pretty cool. And again, for the resistive exercises, they get kind of strapped in, and then they can do like weights and stuff like that. So they all get kind of exercise kind of plans made for them because it's just so important, and especially for them coming back. And even on the missions to Mars, like once they get to Mars, would they even be able to walk if they didn't do all this training and stuff? So it's really like really important.
Wow. What about radiation? The long term, how does that work when people are in space?
So radiation is a big problem, and probably one of the biggest kind of medical problems when we talk about going to Mars. Male and female astronauts have like a radiation exposure limit because of how exposed they might be to radiation and how the kind of adverse effects of this. So female astronauts have a lower radiation exposure limit to male astronauts, and that's because unfortunately they're more susceptible to radiation exposed cancers like breast, ovarian and lung cancer from studies. They have a much lower threshold. So we're protected by the Earth's atmosphere, and on the ISS they have a bit of protection as well. But on the way to Mars, you kind of lose that atmospheric protection and you're exposed to a larger amount of radiation. You're also exposed to kind of like acute radiation blasts, kind of just high energy acute blasts. And then that can kind of lead to acute radiation sickness, and that can be really high risk and also lead to death. So that's a big problem because they can kind of monitor the solar weather, and they do that for spacewalks and things, and they kind of schedule spacewalks around when they think there might be a kind of lower level of radiation happening. But on the way to Mars, again, it's very deep into space, and water is meant to be quite a good kind of insulator.
Okay.
But then, like, I don't know if you would just like surround
be in a big water tank.
Yeah. What about when you drink it all? Then what would you do? So
that's a good point.
It's a really big topic, and I think I think that is genuinely one of the biggest problems with going to Mars. Like, how do we address that problem? Because even if you don't get acute radiation sickness, the problem with radiation is it damages your cellular DNA, it speeds up disease processes, it predisposes you to cancer, cardiovascular disease, visual impairment, stuff like that. Like, they've done a lot of studies on astronauts, long and short duration space flight, and they've studied their eyes. And there's been quite a lot of changes in their vision and the anatomy of their eye. A lot of that is to do with the fluid shift upwards, but they think that a part of it could be radiation as well. So there's lots of problems with it, yeah.
I remember Scott Kelly being interviewed, who is in the International Space Station, and I think he holds the record for being a person who's been in space the longest consecutively with the partner that he was in. And he said that the statistics for former astronauts getting cancer are really disproportionate to what the general population is, so that they're really they're more vulnerable.
Yeah, definitely. Like, being an astronaut is awesome, but then also the health effects are not. Like, it sounds really glamorous, but actually, like, you're kind of putting yourself at risk for a lot of things. And I've just gone through like a few of the changes that happen, and they don't sound that fun, do they? Overall, that's why they have to kind of, it's called a kind of career exposure, and it's measured in millisieverts. I don't know if that's right. I'm not a physicist, but yeah, but females are exposed to less because they're more susceptible. But yeah, you kind of increase your risk of cancer by going to space, cardiovascular disease. But the good thing is you're monitored by a space doctor pretty much your whole life. So at least you've kind of got someone there all the time, and you can maybe spot it earlier than the general population. So that's a plus.
That is a plus. That's true. So there's been a lot of applicable technologies that have come from our research into space that are now used on Earth, from fighting wildfires and satellites and Velcro and all different kinds of really interesting things. Can you say the same for medicine? So a lot of this medical research, is there anything that we can bring down to Earth that has advanced medicine a bit, or questions that you think relate to some of the challenges that we have on Earth?
Sure. So I think from a medical point of view, a lot of what an astronaut does is research, medical and non-medical. But as I was talking about the bone thing, that is a huge topic, and the kind of correct medical term for it is osteoporosis, which kind of affects the elderly population here on Earth, and it predisposes them. Basically, if they had a simple fall, they could fracture their hip, which could end in mortality, essentially. So they do a lot of research into that, because the astronauts are essentially going through this process despite being young because of microgravity. So they have to do a lot of counteractive measures with drugs and diet and exercise, and they can kind of apply that to osteoporotic things on Earth. They do a lot of cancer research as well. So they grow cells that help with the blood supply in the body, endothelial cells, and tumors, cancers use these endothelial cells to grow, essentially use the blood supply. So these cells grow faster in space, and so they test new treatments and things on these cells in space, which is really interesting. They do a lot of work with Alzheimer's as well. They do things with the proteins involved in that, and they do a lot of research into that and maybe slowing down the process. Another thing that NASA was involved in was, in 2010, there was the Chilean miner disaster when the miners were kind of stuck underground. I don't know if you vaguely remember that.
I remember that, yeah.
They're kind of involved in like major disaster stuff too, because these Chilean miners were trapped underground essentially in darkness for months. And you can imagine that there would be kind of psychological problems. There was a lack of sunlight, a lack of proper diet, a lack of exercise, essentially things that the space doctors are used to dealing with in space, like isolation, all these things. So they kind of modified a diet for them that would get them lots of vitamin D, like they do with the alcohol. They kind of modified an exercise plan in this isolated environment so that when they rescued them, they didn't collapse. They kind of organized a sleep schedule for them because they know the importance of sleep and how it can affect mood and kind of social stability. Because that's another thing I didn't mention, but astronauts, their sleep is totally disturbed by kind of cosmic rays, sleeping upwards in a sleeping bag. The sun sets and rises like every 90 minutes as you're circulating. So sleep's a massive thing, and it can totally affect your mood and the vibes of like the whole social situation. So they commented on that. They also kind of devised a diet to help with their blood pressure, like salts, electrolytes, hydration, so that they didn't collapse during the rescue as well. And that's an applicable thing that they do for astronauts coming back to Earth, because, as I said, their circulating volume is lower, so they're more likely to collapse when they stand up because of the blood pressure drop. So there's so many things that they can apply to kind of major disasters and stuff on Earth, which is really interesting.
That's so interesting. I had no idea. And the questions are coming in thick and fast now. So I want to get to a little bit to your research, and then we'll look at some of the questions coming in. But before we go to the research that you're doing in CPR, I just want to, you mentioned really quickly about the mental health of the Chilean miners and NASA suggesting some things from the diet to sleep. Is a space doctor also responsible for the mental health? Or is that a separate
So as far as I'm aware, flight surgeons are kind of involved in psychological support, but I have been to a couple of conferences where there's been a kind of subspecialty for psychologists. There's definitely psychologists and psychiatrists who do kind of work into space medicine. So space medicine is a huge thing and it branches out. So I'm interested in the emergencies. There's people that are interested in the psychology and psychiatry and stuff. So it's kind of like a subspecialty in itself. But as far as I'm aware, the flight surgeons are involved in that. But it is a big thing. And I think psychological screening is one of the biggest parts of medical screening, because you're basically saying to these people, you're going to be away from home for a really long time. If anything happens on Earth to like anyone you love, we can't just bring you back because it compromises the whole mission. You have to accept that. It's kind of monotonous. You're doing the same kind of research and tasks every day. You'll start missing home. You're not sleeping right. Your diet's changed. You have to give up so many things, and it's all about commitment. You have to find people that know that is going to happen and they're not going to suddenly change their mind halfway through. Yeah. And I think, again, it changes going to the ISS where you're a few hours away and if something really bad happens, you could come home. To Mars, where you can't do that. You have to accept you might not come back. Yeah. So it's a really interesting topic, but it's definitely a subspecialty within itself, a big area. And I think we've kind of learned a lot from space with COVID. I know that there's been a lot of research and applying what we know about isolation in space to kind of COVID and how we deal with it and the mental health aspects and stuff. So it probably will become a subspecialty in itself, yeah.
I think everybody during COVID who has suffered in lockdown with isolation and loneliness can now understand and appreciate maybe what's been asked of some of these astronauts who are going on a long mission to Mars. So tell us a little bit about CPR and the research that you're doing.
Sure. So, so basically, as I kind of said earlier, a lot of people kind of wonder why we do research into CPR in space, but it's really because, as I said, although these are young, fit, healthy astronauts, anything could happen and people can have a cardiac arrest for a number of reasons, including reversible causes. They could, if a bit of space junk hit the ISS and there was an oxygen leak and they became hypoxic, they could have a cardiac arrest. If they were involved in a massive trauma and lost a lot of blood, they could have a cardiac arrest. They could be electrocuted and have an arrhythmia. So it's really, it is a thing that could happen. Obviously, we hope it never does, but it could happen. Yeah. So with CPR, which is cardiopulmonary resuscitation, I know a lot of people might not know what I'm talking about. So it's when the heart stops and you want to get it started again. And the first thing we do is kind of pump on the chest to try and get the blood flowing again spontaneously. But the most important thing is it's a time critical thing. You want to start as soon as possible, and then better outcomes the sooner you start. So I think I've sent some pictures to Andy just to go through some of the methods in space, just for context, if that's all right.
I'm very excited to learn this. I've always wanted to know how to do CPR, so I'm sure we'll learn a thing or two.
Perfect, thanks, Andy. So we'll talk about CPR in microgravity first, which is on the ISS, on the way to the moon, on the way to Mars. So this is the handstand method, which is pretty self-explanatory. So what you want to do in this scenario is you want the person needing CPR to be restrained on the bottom of the spacecraft or on the wall. And then you yourself want to do a handstand and kind of push on their chest, but you're actually pushing down with your legs off the top of the spacecraft or off the side to give chest compressions. So in studies on parabolic flights, which are the planes that kind of go up and down and recreate kind of 20 to 30 seconds of weightlessness, this method has had the best results. You're also in a really good position. I think you can see in the photo that they've got a bag and a mask to kind of ventilate them. So that's really important in CPR as well. The problems are you need to be a certain height. So I think I'm about 5'3", so I might not reach the top of the spacecraft, and then I would just float off, and then it would just be futile. You need to be a certain height to do it. That's a problem. You also need to have the person on the bottom restrained, which might take time if they're floating away somewhere else. Yeah. And also, we don't know if the vibrations on the spacecraft could cause a problem, but that's just another thing to think about. The next one is the Evitz-Russellmann method. I think there's another picture, Andy. That's it. So that lady on the right, that's Thais Russamano, who I mentioned earlier, who's very big on the CPR. So this method involves putting your left leg over their right shoulder and then your right leg under their left shoulder, and then you're kind of anchored to that person. So you're kind of attached around the middle, and then you start giving CPR. So the advantages of that method are you can start it immediately. You don't have to worry about restraining the person to the bottom or the side of the spacecraft. You're also in a good position to ventilate them if you needed to as well. The problem is with that one that you could float around and kind of potentially bump into things because you're not restrained. So you could just be floating all over the place and bump into things, which isn't ideal. But other than that, it's a very good method to use. The next one, Andy, thank you. That's called the reverse bear hug. You can understand why. So that's ideal again because you can start it immediately. You can just go behind the person and grab them, and you kind of compress on their chest from behind. That one has had the worst results in simulated studies. I don't know if it's just because of the position or it's just more tiring, but it's just not had very good results compared to the handstand and Evitz Russamano method. So ideally that wouldn't be your first choice. As with the Evitz Russamano method, you can also float around and crash into stuff. So it's not ideal. So we published a guideline, the first guideline for CPR in space last year, and it kind of encompassed airway management, CPR, drugs, everything. And our recommendation was to start with the Evitz Russamano one, which was the second one, because you can start it immediately. And then as soon as you can get that person restrained, start the handstand method because it seems the least fatiguing and you can kind of do it for longer before you get tired, which is really important. So that was our recommendation. The research I did was more concerned with the moon and Mars and how we do CPR there, because it's a bit of a weird one, because on the ISS you have no gravity, but on Mars and the moon you've got a little bit of gravity. But it's kind of problematic because you weigh a lot less when you're there. So it's quite difficult to do CPR the way we do on Earth, which is kind of kneeling or standing beside the person, depending if you're out of hospital or not, and pushing down their chest. So the problem is because you weigh less, you're using, with CPR, you're using your upper body strength, essentially, your upper body. And if you're weighing less, you're basically not strong enough and you're not doing very good chest compressions. And the whole point of CPR is you want a combination of going fast enough, going deep enough, making sure that there's a recoil every time you do a chest compression. And if you're not very strong and you're kind of fatiguing really quickly, they're just going to be rubbish. So our research was kind of into how do we kind of change CPR on Mars or the moon to make it kind of work. So a big thing we kind of proposed to change was, instead of keeping our arms totally straight, which we do on Earth, we kind of bend them, and then using the muscles in our upper arms, we're kind of making up for that lack of weight and generating enough force. So in simulations, we found that helps. Another thing is, which I talked about with the CPR on the ISS, is if you're anchored to someone with your arms, your legs because you'll be using your arms, if you're stable, it means that you're in a better position to do CPR. So in the studies in Brazil, when I was trying to give CPR on the moon and Mars simulations, every time I pushed on the chest, I'd come flying backwards because because I weighed so much less. And then I was like, well, how am I supposed to do this? So if you use your legs to kind of wrap around their legs underneath, and then you're attached to them, and it means you can just start with CPR and keep going. And that kind of had the best results in the studies. So we kind of recommend bending your arms a wee bit, essentially, and anchoring yourself to them. So that was good. So that's the kind of research. But now I'm kind of branching out into emergencies in general and the bigger picture, and kind of preparing for all sorts of emergencies as well, now that we have the guideline. And a lot of people ask about the ethics behind it, because we don't have like intensive care in space. Like, is it ethical to start CPR if you can't do anything afterwards? But obviously we're hoping that when we explore deeper space, that we will have kind of intensive care capability and all those things that come with it. And a lot of people ask about you've maybe not seen these if you're not in a hospital setting, but we have like automated chest devices that do CPR for you. And the whole purpose of them is because CPR becomes really tiring really quickly, and it's really important that you have good quality chest compression. So a lot of people say, well, why do you need to know how to do CPR in space? Why can't you have one of these devices? And it's a totally valid point, but cost is a big thing. They're very heavy. If we use them on a spacecraft, we don't know how the vibrations would affect the structural integrity of the spacecraft. It also takes time to go and find one and put it on. And as I was trying to highlight, like, the sooner you start, the better with CPR. So you want a method. And there's also not been any studies to back up that there's actually a significant difference in using one of these automated devices that keep going and don't fatigue versus actually just giving manual CPR with your hands. So until there's kind of evidence, there's no reason to think that that would be any better than having a guideline. So,
gosh, Christina, thank you so much. That's fascinating. And I do feel like you might be getting called now by some Hollywood producers who need your consultation on CPR scenes in movies. I think we're going to start seeing them in sci-fi. I am going to quickly jump to some of the questions that people really want to ask. And then I have a couple of more of my own too. So from Jillian, she wants to know, where do you see yourself in about 5 years? Do you plan to work more with NASA? And if I could piggyback on her question, I would say, are any of your ambitions actually to go into space?
Sure. So my dream has always been to be a doctor. So I'm living the dream at the moment. And then my bigger dream has always been to be an emergency medicine doctor. So that's the kind of route I'm hoping to go down. I'm still very early on in my career, but I really want to do that. I really want to do space medicine as well. So I'm kind of creating my own kind of path in that I want to do both. It's not a thing as of yet, but I'm just going to try and make it happen. I do want to go into space. I would love to. And I think that if I could combine my passion of being a doctor with going to space, that would be the ultimate dream, and it would be amazing. And I think it's a possible thing, because I think it's a win-win being a doctor and an astronaut, because you have a doctor on board for all these medical emergencies that could go wrong. So I would love to. I am going to apply for the ESA call just because there's nothing to lose and it's a good experience. And then I do think that it's been 11 years since they last recruited, but I don't think it's going to be as long next time, because space is becoming a bigger thing. They're going to be sending people to the moon and Mars, and also commercial spaceflight will be taking off as well. So I think that if you're someone that is applying this time and you don't get in, keep trying, keep applying, because there's always going to be opportunities. And that's the same for me. So I'm going to continue down my route of being an emergency medicine and space doctor. And then if space happens one day, then great. Like,
good for you. That's so awesome. Okay, so Nikki would like to know, what is your favorite thing about space?
I think I know who this question is from. I think it's my friend Nikki. She's just trying to wind me up. Thanks, Nikki. I'll talk to you later. So I think as I kind of touched on earlier, not to repeat myself, but I think the thing is that is so exciting for me is just that there's so much unknown and so much yet to be discovered and to learn from. And I think that's just why it's exciting, because everything you do, you feel like you're making an impact, because that's never been said before, that's never been written before, it's never been researched before. So I think it is the unknown, and I think it's really exciting that in our lifetime we will see people go back to the moon and we will see people go to Mars. And I think it's exciting that the work you're doing, like, you can see an astronaut using that guideline or doing that thing, or it could save an astronaut in space one day. And that's just really, really cool.
It is super.
So I think for all those reasons, that's why I love it. Thanks, Nikki.
That's great. Good to have friends like Nikki. So this is from Jessica, not me, another Jessica. What kind of fitness and medical checks do astronauts have to go through before going into space?
So I think in terms of the medical screening, as I said earlier, it's really looking at kind of things that could cause problems later on. So I think they probably go deep into kind of family history, if you had any genetic traits, cardiovascular problems, kind of diabetes, asthma. Like, it's a shame, but it's the same for pilots. It's just anything that could kind of any kind of chronic conditions or anything you're really at risk of or susceptible of having, because as I said, on the ISS is different, but on the way to Mars, like, your health could cause a risk to the rest of the crew in the mission. And as I said, the life limb mission paradigm kind of changes, unfortunately. and it becomes about the bigger picture, if that makes sense. So
Yes.
I think kind of things that, could cause a problem later on, essentially, you have a pretty thorough screening of everything, and you may have something that you don't even know you have, but it's picked up on medical screening because it's so rigorous. Like, you might have an MRI of your brain and might think, why am I getting this? And then they might find something. Like, you just don't know. In terms of exercise, I don't know specifically, but I do know, as I said, that they do about 2.5 hours a day. Everyone has an individual plan made for them based on their kind of weight, BMI, muscle to fat ratio, and things like that. But as I said, it's really important that they do a lot of aerobic and resistive for their bones and muscles. And I think they kind of devise specific exercise programs to work different muscle groups, just because you wouldn't even think to exercise that muscle because you use it on a daily basis on Earth. But in space, you're not using that muscle at all. So it's just a waste away unless you have a muscle, like an exercise program for it. So I think they have all these weird and wonderful exercise programs that you could probably find out on the website. Sorry, I don't know.
I want to be on an astronaut exercise program. I think that sounds great. So you have a kindred spirit here. Adele is an ED clinical fellow in Dumfries and asks, how does one get involved, or can you get involved in the Space Medicine Society?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm happy to speak to Adele after this somehow if I can get her my contact details. But I meant to say that since starting the Space Medicine Society in 2016, so recently Aberdeen University have just started, I think last year or the year before, a Space Medicine Society, and they just had their first conference, which was amazing, and they had speakers from all over the world in the field of space medicine. They do like workshops and everything. I'm hoping to kind of make space medicine a bigger thing in Scotland, and I think that people are becoming more interested in hearing about it, and there's loads of medical doctors and students that are really interested in it. So there's loads of ways to get involved. I think if you look, there's loads of kind of conferences in the UK. There's now conferences in Scotland. I think conferences are ideal because it's the best way to meet people. That's how I met people at NASA who I'm now working with. You just go to these things, you just talk to people, you emanate how passionate you are and your enthusiasm, and then it just, you get these amazing opportunities. So yeah, I'd encourage kind of looking into these conferences that are happening, networking. I know it's difficult during COVID. It's not the same as, having a drink after a conference at a bar or whatever, but, you can still meet great people and chat to them. So I'm happy to talk to Adele. I'll try and source her out and give her a list of websites and resources. But yeah, there's loads of ways to get involved, sure.
Oh, Christina, brilliant. Thank you. And Jeanette is interested in the effects of extraterrestrial environment on the brain and psychological functioning. So what about concentration, memory, problem-solving abilities, all of which are pretty important in space? Can you say anything about that?
Sure. So they're doing a lot of, in terms of the brain, they're doing a lot of research into raised intracranial pressure. So I kind of touched on earlier about the fluid shifts upwards and how that causes the puffy face and things, and how it can affect your vision because it puts kind of pressure on your optic nerve and stuff. So that's another big thing as well with radiation. They're trying to find ways to stop this increased intracranial pressure because it can cause headaches, visual disturbance, stuff like that. And they need to try and find a way to mitigate that problem. In terms of psychologically, concentration and things like that, again, I think sleep is a big problem, as I mentioned earlier. That can make everyone grumpy, affect their concentration and the social kind of stability of everything. So that I think there's more kind of research going into that because, as I said, I keep highlighting that there's such a difference between being on an 8-month mission to Mars, being there for an inevitable amount of time versus the ISS in terms of psychological issues. And if you really don't get on with someone, like, how do you deal with that? And that's why you need to be that kind of person that just gets on with everyone and can manage kind of situations and stuff. But in terms of the brain, I think that raised intracranial pressure is a really big problem, and it's a really big research topic. If you Google it, you'll probably see some loads of papers from NASA about it. But that with radiation is a big problem. The visual impairment's a big problem because we don't have answers and solutions to these things yet. In terms of psychology, again, a big thing. A lot of research into that and how we kind of mitigate that problem and apply kind of well-being in space. And I think they also have to have a crew that they'll test on Earth that their personalities go.
Yeah.
Because if it's inevitable that you're not, you're going to maybe have a niggle with someone on a journey to Mars or while you're there, or a disagreement about something, but it's how you deal with it, how you focus on the mission, stuff like that. So sorry, that was a very
No, that's really good. That's excellent. Thank you. And so Nicola's next question is actually one I had as well. So I'm really curious about this answer. What makes microgravity such a desirable place for conducting biological science?
I don't actually know. I knew there would be one question that I'm like,
no, that's good.
It's not good.
Can you define, again, for the layman, what is microgravity? Does that mean there's just little bits of it? Is there microgravity? Does it have to be a little bit of it? Does it mean there's no gravity there?
So it's kind of described as a near weightless environment. And it basically happens because of so I talked about the parabolic flights and kind of the free fall motion and how it creates microgravity. So it's basically to do with a ballistic trajectory through space, or the free fall motion as a result of something orbiting Earth at like a certain speed. That's the thing. I don't actually know the answer to that, and I'm really sorry.
No.
My answer was going to be, that's a really good question. I need to look up because
it is. Can you talk about the effects on, if any, when you're talking about CPR, in my head, as I play the movie, and this person is straddling a floating body, trying to get the heart to kind of pump again spontaneously, as you said, does gravity help the heart in general? Is actually the heart have an easier time in microgravity environments?
So they talk about kind of, so the heart, I don't know how this might affect CPR, but this is the problem with our research, because we do all this research and we say, right, this is what we would do, but we can't possibly imitate the physiological changes that the body goes through in space. So although we can say this method would work, we've tried it in studies, we've tried it on parabolic flights, we can't imitate the physiological changes to the cardiovascular system. We know that there's a reduced volume of blood circulating around, which affects the blood pressure. So will that affect CPR? We know that over time, because of radiation and things, that there's cardiovascular deconditioning, higher risk of atherosclerosis, i.e. clogging off the arteries. We know that the heart becomes more spherical, and I don't know the significance of that, but the worry is that the blood pressure and the lower volume of blood circulating, and the fact the heart changes shape, and the fact that their body's undergone this massive change, like, how is that going to affect things? And it's really difficult because it's never happened, and we can't imitate that. And so those are things, factors that we have to consider all the time. And that's why I think that if there were a cardiac arrest in space on the way to Mars, that's why we have to have that intensive care capability to look after them after that, because we have no idea how they're going to react. The positive thing is astronauts are really fit and healthy, so you would hope they would have a better outcome from CPR. They would bounce back better than an elderly person with kind of cardiovascular disease and stuff like that. But it's something we don't know. And another interesting thing is, I'm totally nerding out now, but there was a paper years ago, and I don't know if there's been any paper since, but there was something about how the rib cage changes in space, and how instead it's kind of like that, but instead of that it kind of goes like that. And because it goes like that, it means that there would be a greater distance between you and the heart, because the chest walls so at the moment we've compressed between 5 to 6 centimeters, and that's ideal. But in space, if they've been in space for a long time and their chest walls going like that, do we need to compress deeper? Our compression is going to be good enough? So there's so many questions, and it's annoying for me as a researcher, because you just wonder if it's so hard to know, and that's why it's so gripping, because it's just so.
So, would you do any of your research on the vomit comet? So that kind of thing, that's for people who don't yet.
Yeah, that's what the parabolic flight is. So I'd love to. I haven't yet, but I'm hoping that one day I will. Some of the guys who co-wrote the CPR guideline paper with us went up and did the airway stuff, and that's how they got the results of that. So they went up with mannequins and tried to intubate them and tried different airway techniques to work out what was the easiest, what had the best results and stuff. So that was all part of our paper, which was really exciting. And I know in the past, people have gone up. Thais has gone up to do research, and we've gone up to do kind of CPR research and things in the past. The problem with it is you only get kind of 20 to 30 second bursts of microgravity. Yeah. And then you go back to normal, and then you do it again. So you don't have, with CPR, the problem is you're doing it for about 2 minutes, stopping, 2 minutes, stopping, whereas you can only do it for like 25 seconds. So it's not realistic to the real scenario. But I'd love to do it one day, just because it would be fun. It
would be so fun. Do you know, we have so many questions, and I do apologize for the people at home. We're not going to get to all of them. Christina, this has been so interesting. I am going to choose just one more, because we're going to end on a little bit of a women in space themed question. You talked a little bit about the biological differences between men and women in space, women sometimes being, with the different organs, more vulnerable to things like breast tissue cancer and ovarian cancer, at least sensitive to the radiation. So Elaine would like to know, how does space affect female hormone cycle? And do we know, or is that another unknown that we're going to have to wait and see?
So again, great question. Not something I know a lot about. It's definitely a studied topic. Someone sent me a video recently about when a female astronaut, I think, had her time of month, and there was this joke about how NASA sent 100 tampons for 6 days or 3 days.
That's hilarious.
Very, very funny, and I've been meaning to speak to my friend at NASA about it, just to find a bit more about that. So so that was quite funny. But anyway, it's definitely something that is, there's a researcher in Edinburgh who I'm sure does a lot of talks about this. I'm sure she was on the BBC and stuff about kind of female aspects of space and hormones and the menstrual cycle and stuff. I'm embarrassed to say it's not something I know a lot about. Space medicine is such a huge topic. It's like medicine, and I kind of focus on the things I focus on. So it's not really something I honestly know a lot about, but because I'm embarrassed that I don't know it, I will be looking it up. There is a researcher at Edinburgh University who publishes a lot of stuff about that in space, and I'm going to go and look it up after this talk. But I'm really
No. Look, your focus is in emergency medicine, and even that is huge. I mean, that can be an endless topic. And so just kind of embracing the idea of women in space, because you're really a pioneer, and you are blazing the trail, I think, for a lot of other women interested in medicine and interested in space medicine coming after you. Medicine has typically been a male-dominated field. I know things are changing. You and I talked a little bit about that before, but space is this like fresh frontier. Do you sense that things are quite open, and that it's a friendly place for women to explore their careers? Do you feel that things are changing?
Absolutely. Like, I think I watched Kelly's talk the other night, and she talked about this quite a lot, and I kind of agreed with everything she said. So I think she said we're going in the right direction, but we're not there yet. And I think she said something like 11% of all astronauts are female, so we're definitely still not at that balance. And that needs to change. I think what's encouraging about the European Space Agency call is they kind of mention gender and kind of equality in the recruitment process in terms of that. In medicine, certainly we're seeing a change in terms of typically male-dominated specialties like emergency medicine, surgery, orthopedic surgery. We're seeing more females come into the specialty, which is great. And I think another thing Kelly said, which really hit home, was like, if we are going to Mars and potentially colonizing another planet, like, we need kind of gender equality, we need cultural diversity. You know, we need to start it that way. We don't just go with like men.
Yeah.
Like, gender equality and
like, sorry, Matt Damon, but that might not be what's happening. Yeah,
it's so true, and it's so right. So I think what I would say is we're going in the right direction. Things are definitely, changing, and it's been highlighted, but we're definitely not there yet. I mean, sexism still exists. And when I go to these conferences and I present, my audience is probably like 95% men. And there's so I don't know, I just made that number up, but I just mean like you're looking out into the audience and it's like all men and a few women. And I know so many women in the space medicine field who want to be astronauts, who want to be space doctors, and that's amazing because there's so many in my kind of generation that want to do it. But it just shows that in previous generations, so these men are kind of higher up in the field who've been doing it for 20, 30 years, that it was like all men.
Yeah.
So things are definitely changing. Things are going in the right direction. But yeah, agreed with Kelly. We're not there yet. But
well, Christina, I'm so glad that you exist and you're doing what you're doing. Honestly, keep on rocking it. And we cannot wait to see you not only as a full-fledged space doctor, but maybe in space one day, guiding people on the way to Mars. Thank you so much for joining us for Big Bang Week.
Thanks for having me. Thanks very much. I loved it.
Thank you.